Story 1. A turkey vulture struck one of our engines, and it caught fire. A young boy sitting by the window became so frightened that he was sick. It was his first flight. Additionally, it turned out that Sinbad was on the plane as well. Story 2. I boarded a plane in northern Canada, specifically Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, and flew for 15 hours only to end up back at the airport where I started. Due to blizzard conditions, the plane couldn't land at the destination, Rankin Inlet, Nunavut. We refueled in Churchill, Manitoba, and then again in Kuujjuaq, northern Quebec, before attempting to land in Rankin again, unsuccessfully on the return trip. It was the longest, scariest, and most miserable flight of my life. Story 3. I got into a metal tube, and then a mixture of volatile petrochemicals began a controlled explosion that made the big fan spin very fast. Suddenly, we were in the sky going hundreds of miles per hour while the person driving this machine couldn't even see where we were going. Later, he pointed it at the ground, and we basically slid to a halt without dying. Story 4. The passengers and crew of my flight were incapacitated due to food poisoning. A rogue pilot with a drinking problem had to cooperate with his ex-girlfriend, who had become a flight attendant, to safely land the plane. Story 5. A Midwestern dad in his 50s who was sitting next to me performed a 3-minute rap that he wrote for his 15-year-old son who committed suicide. This was years ago, and I still think about it often. One time, while flying domestically in Chile, we had to make an emergency landing because of an unruly passenger who was running up and down the aisle and shouting. I don't speak Spanish, so I didn't really know what was going on. But we landed in a small town in southern Chile, and the police boarded the plane and arrested him. Story 6. I remember the time when my flight hit turbulence, the lights flickered, and someone screamed, "Repent!" from the back. We all became quite religious very quickly. Story 7. Way before September 11th, a man in Magadan, Russia, smuggled parrots and a cat in a carry-on. He thought he had them sedated, but whatever he used wore off and they started fighting in the carry-on. Story 8. I remember taking a flight to Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport when we were informed that the front landing gear would not deploy and that we were going to have an emergency landing. They announced that they would foam the runway and that emergency vehicles would meet us after we made contact with the ground. We went through the procedures for using the emergency slides. I made many promises during that flight. Then they somehow manually lowered the landing gear, and we had a relatively normal landing. We were greeted by emergency vehicles and exited the plane through the main door onto the stairs leading to the tarmac. Story 9. I flew halfway to Paris from O'Hare and had to turn around because de Gaulle didn't have anywhere to park the plane. It gets worse. We were flying with a toddler. Story 10. Once I felt lightheaded and thought I might pass out or vomit. I wandered to the back of the plane with the intent of sitting in the bathroom for a bit. I ended up in the rear galley, tried to open the emergency exit, couldn't, and passed out on the floor. I woke up shortly afterward and walked back to my seat. Somehow nobody noticed. Story 11. Flying through a storm was the craziest experience. There was lots of turbulence, followed by depressurization, but the oxygen masks did not deploy, so we were likely at a lower altitude. My ears popped, water bottles spilled, and the perfumes in the carry-on luggage burst open, causing me to sneeze uncontrollably. Many of the overhead bins flew open, and the flight attendants moved through the cabin, closing them and firmly instructing passengers to remain seated with their seatbelts fastened. As a teenager, I thought this was normal and considered the flight attendants somewhat unfriendly. Now I understand better. Story 12. I am going to add this not because it was a bad experience, but because it was very unusual and good. There was a baby on the plane from Korea to, I think, Georgia. If I remember correctly, it was a 9-hour flight, but the mom handled her baby like a champion. She played with him and kept him busy. The baby didn't cry once. She was also extremely kind and polite. Story 13. Recently, I went on a flight, and an elderly lady was screaming, "Let me go! You just want to take advantage of me. You can't have it." Then she would flash everyone. Her son was sitting next to her. It was an 8-hour flight, and this went on for a total of 2 hours. Story 14. One of the engines exploded over the middle of Lake Erie. We arrived in Cleveland after 30 tense and quiet minutes and had a perfect landing. Everyone applauded. At the gate, an attendant had to find flights for 300 people as flights to Dallas were being canceled due to storms. Many of those who applauded the pilots were rude to the attendant trying to book flights for 300 unexpected passengers. It was shameful. Story 15. The plane was going through a storm over the Gulf of Mexico and was struck by lightning, which apparently isn't that big of a deal. However, I was 8 and thought we were going to die. The lights went out, and the flight attendant who was serving dinner screamed and spilled a meal all over a lady a few rows back. We made it to Costa Rica just fine, though. Story 16. The plane started sliding on the runway after touching down. Everyone clapped when we stopped, and some cried. The captain came out and said, "That was a spicy one." Story 17. When I was younger, I was on a flight in the window seat near the wing. We had pulled out of the gate when a large ball of fire flared up from the engine, though there was no real explosion. Many people jumped up and started running down the aisle for a brief moment. Everything was fine, but we obviously had to deplane. Story 18. I was going from Milwaukee to John F. Kennedy International Airport to Barcelona. My first flight was super delayed, but the gate attendant assured me I could make it if I got off the plane quickly and rushed to my next flight. Essentially, I couldn't afford any delays whatsoever. My seat was in the aisle, and there were 2 guys already in the row, both dressed in gray sweatpants. The guy in the middle seat immediately started talking to me about boot camp, and I was doing my best to ignore him. As we were taking off, I pulled out my headphones, and he started rubbing himself. He pulled his seat tray down to hide what he was doing, but it was evident. Eventually, he stopped talking to me, but even the guy next to him, who apparently knew him, looked over, saw what was happening, and just ignored it. In hindsight, I wish I had said something, but I was so afraid of the flight getting delayed and missing my connection. Honestly, it was so bizarre that I don't think I was processing the situation in real time. It was a super short flight, and I told myself I could just deal with it. I have to believe something was mentally off as well as physically wrong with the guy. Anyway, I made my connection, and now I have this strange story to tell. Story 19. The captain acted as if we were about to experience significant turbulence, which made sense since we were near a mountainous region. However, the turbulence was barely noticeable. Story 20. I was on a non-stop flight from Germany to Los Angeles with my 2-year-old, and the guy sitting next to me kept getting up and changing seats with 5 other people. For 13 hours, this man kept rotating out with his friends. Eventually, we struck up a conversation, and he told me he was going to smoke. It was the 1990s, and international flights allowed smoking. He and his buddies were from Egypt and were musicians. They were flying from Egypt to Los Angeles to work at a house party in Malibu, with 5 Middle Eastern men and large instrument cases. When I got to customs, the security dog smelled my bag and alerted, but I didn't know it at the time. They took my customs ticket, marked it, and told me to get in line. I was subjected to intense security checks and questioning. It turns out that a young mother traveling alone next to some suspicious travelers seemed like the perfect mule to them. It was awful. Story 21. Ran off the runway into the brush upon landing, but that was just the warm-up. I was 14 and had been terrified of flying even before that. I swore I wouldn't fly again, but I was chosen for a nationwide trip with my school a month later. On the flight home from the school trip, we narrowly missed the control tower due to extreme weather and a communication mix-up, and ended up practically vertical on approach. We did land safely with 180 students on board, but after leaving the airport, one of the teacher chaperones died in a car crash on the highway home. That was 36 years ago, and I still need to be heavily medicated for a 45-minute flight. I hate flying. Story 22. Back in the 70s, I was flying from Dallas to Champaign-Urbana. It was a jet, but it was what was called a puddle jumper flight. We landed at every small town between Dallas and Champaign. At one airport, there was one runway and 2 taxiways leading to each end of the runway, forming a perfect triangle of pavement. Back then, there was no fence around the airport. It was entirely surrounded by a cornfield, and there was corn planted inside the triangle. You could see the chevrons of mud from the tractor tires driving across one of the taxiways to get inside the triangle. The runway was too short, so when the plane turned onto the taxiway, we all had to lean over as if we were in a car taking a turn too fast. Nobody got off at the airport, but a couple of high school coaches boarded with the basketball team going to an away game. They didn't have tickets. The coach and the flight attendant got them seated, and the coach pulled out a wad of cash to pay for the players' tickets just as they wheeled the stairs away and closed the door. I mentioned the runway was too short. We started the takeoff speeding on the taxiway, and everyone leaned way over as the plane made the sharp turn onto the runway. The pilot really gunned it on the straightaway, and off we went. There was no fear, nobody thought about crashing. It was an interesting experience of life in the places that are often overlooked. New pilots were gaining experience in short-haul flights, hoping for the chance to fly in the big leagues. Back then, it was all flight attendants, and I have no idea what they were hoping for. Story 23. If there is a doctor on board, please make yourself known to the cabin crew. This was on a Boeing 747 halfway across the Pacific Ocean. A man had a heart attack and died. He was covered by a sheet for the rest of the flight. Story 24. I was on an overnight flight to Rome and fell asleep for a while. When I woke up, the couple across the aisle from me was having intimate relations. Story 25. I am sitting on top of the engine pylon at around 3 a.m. I look at the mechanic and say, "Yes, you have a crack on that inner bracket. You will need someone to write a repair for that." Story 26. I smoked marijuana in the bathroom during a flight from Chicago to San Diego when I was 18, along with my parents on the plane. It was a foolish decision. Story 27. We were taking off out of Las Vegas when we reached about 12,000 feet and heard a loud boom, followed by the plane shutting off. The power came back on, and the engines restarted. The pilots reported a master alarm and needed to reboot the plane. We lowered the landing gear and circled the airport for 45 minutes while ground personnel examined the plane through binoculars. They confirmed that the plane appeared to be in good condition, so we continued on to our destination. Story 28. Takeoff and landing at different airfields in Afghanistan was always an experience. Zero gravity over Helmand was a trip. Story 29. Bomb threat. The plane was diverted for an emergency landing. We were not allowed to disembark. From the windows, we saw a perimeter of emergency vehicles. They served us ice cream while a few panicked passengers argued that prioritizing women and children was outdated. Story 30. Decent turbulence. But when you realize the plane is the ship and the air is the ocean, it makes everything better. Story 31. LAX to LHR, January 2021. 787 Dreamliner. There were 28 people on the entire plane. I was in Economy Plus, which has 48 seats in that section. There were only 2 passengers and 46 empty seats. It was brilliant. Story 32. I met Franco Harris, a running back for the Pittsburgh Steelers in the 1970s and 1980s, and got his autograph. The only paper I had was a newspaper from the late 1990s. About 3 months later, I saw that my then-wife had used the newspaper for the new Puppy's Pee spot. Story 33. It wasn't that crazy, but it felt crazy. I was on a plane when we hit some turbulence. No big deal, I thought. Then the pilot came on the intercom and said, "Hi everyone. Don't worry about the turbulence. That thumping sound you hear is just ice hitting the side of the plane." He sounded nervous and scared. He shouldn't have said anything. Story 34. I passed out once and caused a scene. I think I grew up with some underlying health problems because every so often my blood sugar would crash, and I would essentially shut down in public, often throwing up in the process. The incidents were several years apart, so it was never something I looked into. It always made sense. It would happen on a stressful day when I had not slept or eaten. One of the more memorable incidents was on a flight with my family when I was 16. We were traveling for a cruise, and I had been up all night because we had to leave early for the flight, which disrupted my routine. I got some sleep on the plane, but when I woke up, the pressure in my ears was intense. I kept trying to yawn and chew to relieve it, but it wasn't working. I started to panic a little and realized I needed to vomit. I was crammed in at the window with two strangers between me and the aisle. Thankfully, the flight had vomit bags in the seat compartments, so I grabbed one and filled it as quickly as I could. They allowed me to go to the bathroom to dispose of the bag. And that is the last thing I remember. Suddenly, there were people standing over me, saying, "Oh, I think he's awake. Yeah, he's awake. Hey, you okay?" Everyone had already gotten off the plane at that point, so it was just my family and some staff around me. Not only did I pass out through the bathroom door, but I also started convulsing on the floor right in front of everybody. For some reason, the day before, I had traced the veins on my wrist with a blue pen and then used red ink to make it look like they were bleeding. I wasn't that sort of kid. It was just a coincidence with the right pens. This startled everyone, and I had to reassure them that I had not harmed myself. I'm sure I have been part of many people's craziest experiences on a plane as well. Story 35. My wife had a seizure on a plane, and the flight had to be diverted. I thought everyone would complain, and I'm sure some did, but in my area, everyone was just concerned for her. A different lady I didn't know, who was apparently a nurse, was a huge help. I really wish I could have gotten her name to thank her, but it was a great moment to see people being compassionate toward each other. Story 36. Not me, but my dad. During a short final approach, approximately 1,000 feet above the ground, my dad was in first class in the very front row when the cockpit door suddenly opened. The captain yelled at the flight attendant, "Get in here." She jumped up, ran in, and the door slammed shut. They landed without incident, and when the door opened, the flight attendant walked out, ghostly white, and sat down. Another flight attendant asked, "What happened?" She replied, "The first officer had a seizure." The other flight attendant exclaimed, "On final?" The first attendant said, "Sure, we don't want anyone else to hear." Well, my dad heard. He spent quite a bit of time at the bar that night. Story 37. We were on a flight from Los Angeles to Hawaii, and my little sister, who was a toddler, was sitting behind Jenna Jameson's seat. She accidentally kicked it, which made Jenna upset with her and my mom. Story 38. 1. Minneapolis to New York City. While in the air, the captain was describing how tailwinds were giving us a boost in speed and that we would arrive early. He said, "We are going really super fast." 2. New York City to Chicago. The flight was delayed due to severe thunderstorms in the Midwest. We took off 90 minutes late and flew beside a massive storm. The turbulence was more than I have ever experienced, but it wasn't too scary. The coolest thing was watching the lightning out the window. It was right there. The whole storm was just next to us, floating in space. I will never forget it. Story 39. The flight attendant asked to see my boarding pass. I handed it over and she disappeared. A couple of minutes later, a different attendant appeared with an unfamiliar man. This new attendant informed me that I had taken this man's seat. I reached for my boarding pass and realized it had been stolen. I sat there, ignoring the attendant and the man, and a minute later, they both walked away. It was bizarre. Story 40. Okay, here we go. New York to Qatar. A 6-hour layover before the final destination of Tbilisi. I get on the plane and I'm seated next to someone who is probably originally from Qatar or a nearby country. He didn't speak any English at all and was a larger man, which is important. He was acting a little strange, ordered a wine, and drank it pretty quickly. I'm getting settled in. It's about an hour into a 13-hour flight, and I look over to see this man looking up and appearing to choke. Some liquid is slightly dripping down the side of his mouth, so I recall my scout training that in the event of choking on liquid or vomit, you need to be turned on your side. I stand up and gently push this man onto my seat, and he promptly throws up on me. At this point, I think he's passed out. I press the button to summon a flight attendant, and they immediately see what's happened and help the man to the restroom. Now I'm covered in vomit, and I had to check my carry-on because it was 1 pound over the limit for some reason. So I've got a seat with vomit on it, and my clothes are also stained. The vomit appears to be a mixture of red wine and curry, creating an awful combination of scents and sensations on my body. I asked the attendant if there is anything that can be done to help with this situation. Extra clothes, a bathrobe, a new seat, anything. They moved me to a middle seat. I was originally in an aisle, and said there was nothing that could be done about the stench or my clothes. I felt very bad for the passengers I was moved next to and pretty bad for myself because I still had over 20 hours left wearing this man's vomit. When I landed in Doha, it became immediately clear that I couldn't afford to buy any clothes in the airport. There was a store selling gold right as you got off the plane. So, I wore curry and red wine vomit from a stranger for the next 20 hours. Story 41. Pre-internet. I was 17 and traveling around Guatemala alone after studying at an immersion language school one summer. On my last weekend, I was waiting to board a flight for an overnight stay at the incredible Mayan city of Tikal, in the middle of the Petén rainforest. Flying in and out was really the only practical way to get there at that time. Then the gate agent informed us that there was a mechanical problem with the plane. The flight was canceled, and there wouldn't be another one until the next day. This meant I would have to cancel my trip. I tried to make a case with the gate agent, but she didn't seem to care. A man in a captain's uniform tapped me on the shoulder and told me to come with him. I followed him along with a group of about 6 people to another gate. He mentioned that they had a smaller plane available. We went out onto the tarmac and saw that it was a little propeller plane. The other passengers boarded first, and I noticed there were exactly 6 seats, all occupied. When I asked where I was supposed to sit, one of the other travelers jokingly suggested I sit on the wing. The captain entered behind me, closed the door, and said I would sit with him up front, which instantly made everyone else in their cramped seats with tiny windows very jealous. The flight took about an hour or so, and we were flying at a low altitude, so the captain pointed out all the rivers and geological features of the area. The seat was very comfortable, the view was unforgettable, and Tikal was incredible. Everyone should visit there at least once. But that flight will always be special to me. Story 42. Before takeoff, the pilot announced over the public address system that due to the expected weather conditions, the flight would likely be rough, with limited opportunities, if any, to turn off the seatbelt sign. He also mentioned that in-flight beverage service would be restricted so the flight staff could remain seated with their seatbelts fastened. He then went on to explain how airplanes operate. He shared that as long as we are moving forward, the shape of the wings will keep us in the air, stating, "The plane wants to remain in the air." He also mentioned that those of us in a window seat might see the wings flex up and down and assured us that the wings would not fall off the plane. He committed to getting us to our destination safely, stating, "I have a family too that I want to get home to." He concluded with, "Now sit back and enjoy your flight." Story 43. Many years ago, my father was a mechanic for an airline that flew Twin Otters, which are short takeoff and landing planes. I went along, probably around 12 years old, when he and a pilot had to shuttle one of the planes to a larger airport for a special checkup. It was just the 2 adults and me on board. That airport had never had a Twin Otter land before, so after talking with the control tower for a while, they gave permission for an unrestricted takeoff because they wanted to see what the plane could do. Normally, commercial planes take off at about 15 degrees. We ascended at 60 degrees, and it felt like I was lying on my back. We leveled off to a normal climb at 5,000 feet, and the end of the runway passed beneath us. It was my craziest ride ever. Story 44. The person behind me said that all Democrats should be convicted of treason for voting for Kamala Harris and also expressed a wish for Republicans to go to war with Democrats. I responded by telling him to just order his drink and be quiet. Story 45. Hit really heavy turbulence on the way down from 30,000 feet into Chicago. I mean the kind of turbulence that would have broken necks on the ceiling if not strapped in. Even the flight attendants were screaming for about 2 solid minutes. The pilot was constantly adjusting the throttle to do what he could. But sometimes it is useless and you just have to fly through it. I had the biggest smile on my face the entire time and even pointed out the window to the random person next to me to watch the wing flex. He didn't appreciate that. Anyway, it always amuses me how quickly people panic and stay panicked long after the event itself is over. Amuse might not be the right word. Perhaps intrigue is better. Aside from that, it's always fun to watch people get anxious when they arrive at an empty gate with 3 minutes left until the ticketed takeoff time. Story 46. landing while it was snowing and slightly before sunrise. I also had my first experience driving on a freeway during the snowfall. Story 47. The lady next to me on a red-eye flight from San Francisco to New York City vomited on my leg while I was asleep. I had no idea until she woke me up to tell me, and that's what upset me. Of course, I didn't say anything, but I thought, look lady, I've been vomited on before, but I need this sleep on the flight. Please do not wake me up. I never fell back asleep, so thanks a lot. Story 48. Flying back from New Orleans, halfway through the flight, a crawfish started crawling up the aisle. A few rows of passengers noticed it and were a bit startled, but my son simply reached down, picked it up, and handed it to the flight attendant. A few minutes later, a man came from the back looking for his crawfish that had escaped. How it got through security is beyond me. Story 49. I had a solo work trip and was assigned a center seat on an 11.5-hour flight. I felt anxious throughout the entire journey. Story 50. I was sitting next to one of the engines when it stopped humming for a while. I have no idea how long it was until it started running again, but hearing the engine quit running on an airplane is interesting. Story 51. I had a 3-hour flight with an aisle seat against the rear bulkhead next to the restroom. A young lady occupied the window seat and cried the entire trip. I also became the bathroom monitor, asking, "Is someone in there?" I had to look for the red or green indicator. People kept getting in and out, and I had to endure their movements close to me repeatedly. I sat as thin as I could during the long flight. Story 52. I was flying to the Netherlands for work with a stop in Iceland during winter. We encountered a severe storm, and the pilot had to make an emergency landing at another airport. I cannot remember the name of the airport, but the runway was so short that the pilot warned us via the intercom beforehand. He sounded nervous, which made me terrified. It did not help that we could not see anything because of the storm, and this happened at night. I do not know how he landed that large plane in what felt like a 5-second landing during a blizzard, but he did. I was holding the hand of the stranger next to me the whole time. Story 53. A lady sitting next to me suddenly looked at me as if she needed something, then passed out. My other seatmate and I called the flight attendant, and it quickly became serious. I had to grab my belongings and move to an empty seat so a doctor could sit next to her. She regained consciousness a few moments later and seemed fine. I believe she had some form of epilepsy and experienced a minor seizure. Story 54. On a transatlantic flight descending into Newark, we were struck by lightning. The pilot announced that we had to circle while they checked things out, and I suspect it was to burn off fuel. This plane had a display that showed the flight path. At one point, I noticed that we had closed the loop and were right back where we started. Then we were struck by lightning a second time. After another delay, we landed and were met by an escort of fire and emergency vehicles. In the end, everything was fine, and we pulled to the gate and disembarked normally. Story 55. A passenger was intoxicated and being aggressive towards those around him. He was asked to leave the flight but refused. The police were called. He continued to refuse, so they used a taser on him and removed him from the aircraft. In China, for an adoption, one of the domestic flights was on a very old and run-down plane. The overhead bins wouldn't close, the seats were torn, the lights didn't work, the door had difficulty closing, and there were chickens in cages on the flight. Our Chinese interpreter kissed the ground when we landed, saying she had never been on a flight that bad. Fortunately, the rest of our flights were on very new planes. Story 56. In 1974, I was on a DC-10 flying from New York City to Chicago. We were airborne for 20 minutes when the pilot announced on the intercom, "We have turned back to New York City because the baggage door might not be completely locked." So we returned to New York City and changed planes. A month later, a Turkish DC-10 took off from Paris, and the baggage door popped open, tearing off the tail of the plane, resulting in the deaths of 350 people in the crash. I had forgotten all about my DC-10 experience until I saw the video online and realized that I had narrowly escaped death. Story 57. On a plane that was struck by lightning mid-flight, it sounded like a shotgun went off with a flash of light. About 5 minutes later, which felt much longer, the pilot came over the intercom and explained what had happened, assuring us that everything was okay. Scared me quite a bit. Story 58. I took a flight from Miami to Granada one night. Veterinary students were returning to school from break, and they all had their service animals. We encountered a storm during the flight. The animals behaved better than the humans. It was a fun time. Story 59. On Air France, they called for a doctor. For the third time, I asked if a paramedic might help. One person spoke Russian, while another bystander spoke both Russian and German. A member of the flight crew spoke German and French, and another spoke French and English, which is my language. The person was having a panic attack, and with much translation, we managed to calm her down, laughing and hugging everyone. They gave me a bottle of French champagne. Story 60. Not me, but my brother was a witness to this. A few minutes before landing in Los Angeles, a man stood up and started taking his clothes off. Before he could be stopped, he was in his birthday suit. The flight attendants threw a blanket over him, and a large man held him down until the plane landed and the police came aboard to remove him. For me, the craziest incident was on a Mexicana flight many years ago, when the pilot announced that any children who wanted to visit the cockpit could come up. My private pilot husband couldn't help himself. He bolted from his seat and practically pushed the kids out of the way to get up there. He was in the cockpit so long I thought they were letting him fly the plane. None of that, of course, could happen today. Story 61. Hit by lightning while waiting to land in Chicago. We received clearance quickly after that, but everything was fine. Story 62. I lived in Arcata, California, for a while. The only flights to San Francisco at the time were propeller planes. Flying back to Arcata from San Francisco one time, our flight was canceled that evening due to weather. We all slept in the airport until the first flight the next morning. That morning flight felt like we were in a paper airplane being tossed by a fan, with multiple drops and shaking throughout the flight. The entire plane was praying and panicking. When we landed in Arcata and got off the plane, we kissed the ground. Story 63. First flight. Descending into Salt Lake City, the plane suddenly turned sharply. Another plane was taking off on the same runway. Story 64. Landing in Pensacola during a thunderstorm. On our third attempt to land, I thought to myself, just put it down in the swamp and I will wade to the road. We finally touched down, and when I looked in the cockpit as we deplaned, the pilot appeared to be about 16 years old. Story 65. An elderly individual exhibited racist behavior in first class after a black flight attendant touched her. The pilot came out of the cockpit and informed her that if she did not remain quiet and treat his crew with decency and respect, she would be arrested and permanently banned from the airline. She complied and remained silent for the remainder of the flight. Story 66. I flew to Europe on a turboprop in 1969. The constant loud noise from the engines made it quite an experience, and even then, it was unusual. The plane wasn't full, so I was able to stretch out along 3 seats. Story 67. The first flight was a military journey on a surplus airplane. You get strapped to a bench on the side of a large cargo plane like a paratrooper. I was only 4, terrified and screaming, but it was too loud to hear anyone. Then, fortunately, I passed out. It was free. Story 68. We went to Maui for our honeymoon. The flight was fine until we started to land. The wheels hit the ground and then we shot straight back up. It was very windy, and we had to fly around the entire island again. The man in front of me was ill. Story 69. A woman 1 row in front of me and to the right seemed to be sleeping but was actually unconscious. A situation the flight attendant discovered while doing the drink service. The drink service was quickly abandoned as all the flight attendants and several nurses converged in the aisle to tend to the woman. While they were occupied, the woman next to me started asking, "Where's the drink cart? Why did they stop serving?" I explained that they were busy with an emergency. She responded, "I'm a passenger too, and I want coffee," and turned on her overhead light to call for assistance. When a flight attendant arrived, she requested coffee. The flight attendant informed her that it wasn't possible at that time. Eventually, they moved the unconscious woman to the back galley to lie down. She did regain consciousness, but the woman next to me turned to the man behind us and exclaimed, "Tell them I want something to drink." The flight attendant returned and explained that she could not access the coffee pot because the woman was lying on the floor in front of it. The woman next to me was furious and began complaining that she was a passenger as well. She wanted to know how many flight attendants were on the flight because she planned to write a letter and file a complaint about the service. Story 70. When I was 34, I had to fly back to my home state because my dad was in bad shape and not expected to make it. A young lady, about 22 to 25 years old, sat next to me. After takeoff, I leaned forward slightly with my face in my hands, thinking about my dad. The next thing I noticed was that she put her head on my shoulder and slept the entire flight. Right before descent, she woke up and talked to me about random things, and that was it. She never said a word about sleeping on me. Felt like I was her dad or uncle. She was that comfortable. Story 71. I was literally about to panic while waiting for the flight. The flight attendant told me to sit down. I explained that if I had to walk back to my seat, I would cause an embarrassing situation for everyone on the plane due to my discomfort. It was a standoff and I won. I know you aren't supposed to form a line, and I've never done this before or since. Story 72. I am old enough to remember getting a seat assigned in the row right behind the smoking section. It basically meant I was in that section myself. Story 73. I flew first class on Emirates A380 for 12 hours to my honeymoon. I enjoyed unlimited caviar and expensive champagne, and I even got to take a shower. Story 74. I experienced turbulence while in the bathroom after finishing. I completed wiping and was pulling up my pants. While standing with my pants around my legs, I managed to maintain my balance. Fortunately, I was able to pull my pants up without falling out of the door. Story 75. We had a medical emergency, as in the "is anyone on board a doctor?" kind, and had to make an emergency landing in Denver. The issue was that we were landing through a severe thunderstorm, which I know no other planes were attempting. My seat faced two flight attendant seats that were positioned towards the rear. They stopped joking around and making roller coaster arm waves when things got really intense. Let's just say my tolerance for moderate turbulence has been adjusted. The person to my right didn't like flying even in the best of times, so I was trying to keep her calm while I heard people vomiting into bags throughout the cabin. Felt like something out of a movie. Story 76. My wife and I had the front seat in economy with plenty of legroom. Unfortunately, many people decided that was the perfect spot to stand around and wait for the bathroom. An older lady started getting dizzy and fell onto me while I was sitting in the seat. I helped her get up, and she immediately began vomiting away from me but in the general vicinity. She grabbed a pillow, laid down right there, and turned away from the vomit. After a long 5 minutes, a flight attendant came and forcibly removed the lady, making her sit back in her seat. The pillow and vomit were not cleaned up for over 20 minutes after that. It was quite a situation. Story 77. Honeymoon flight to Maui, 6 hours. My screen in front of me was stuck in a boot loop for the entire flight. Nobody could fix it. Story 78. After taking my girlfriend up in a rented Cessna, a thunderstorm rolled in just as we were coming in to land at our small airport. It was raining heavily with sustained winds of 25 knots, gusting up to 30 knots. The wind direction was variable, around 45 degrees off the runway. This was definitely the scariest landing I have ever done. My girlfriend loved it, rating it a perfect 10 out of 10. Story 79. About 10 years ago, I had to scout a remote location in northern Kenya for a British television reality show. The producer and I arrived at Nairobi Airport to meet a man with a plane. This was by far the quickest way to get there. The pilot was a sophisticated and handsome British man with the most beautiful, yet small, antique airplane that just fit the three of us and a couple of bags. We flew north over the Rift Valley, stopping for lunch at a luxurious nature sanctuary, then continued further across misty hills and onto mud flats full of pink flamingos, all the way to a very remote volcanic island in the middle of a vast lake filled with crocodiles. It was called Turkana. At the airstrip, just a sandy stretch of desert, tribesmen tried to sell me gold. We chartered a boat and explored the island, which had no infrastructure whatsoever, not even a wooden hut. While mind-blowing and exciting, after a few hours we realized this place was too difficult for the production to shoot, and the pilot suggested we try Uganda. This seemed like a good idea, so we got back in the plane and flew there. The brief experience of having your own airplane and exploring a vast and wild land was incredible. Story 80. Taxiing on a Southwest flight from Ontario, California, to Phoenix, we were delayed. The Antonov 225, the world's largest plane, was ahead of us in Ontario for some reason. The captain informed us that it started shedding parts on the runway while taxiing and had to cancel its takeoff to allow for the runway to be cleared for our flight. Story 81. Circling, delays, screaming, and fighting on board led to a return to Indiana due to a storm delay. There was more yelling. Passengers deplaned and attempted to sleep in the closed airport, then boarded again only to circle the storm and be routed back to Indiana. More fighting ensued. After another 4 hours, the flight finally took off and landed in Chicago. Story 82. Flying from Philadelphia to Dallas on a warm Sunday night, I realized as the plane took off that the engines were running roughly and we weren't as high as we should have been. I had the window seat and looked out to see jet fuel venting from the wing. The pilot announced that we had lost an engine and would return to the airport, but first we needed to shed some fuel. We circled over New Jersey and released the fuel. It hit me how serious the situation was when I saw several fire trucks following us down the runway. This was before September 11th, so my parents were still at the gate. I called home, but they had not made it home yet, so I left a message on their answering machine. "Hi, I almost crashed, but didn't." They arranged for a smaller plane to take us to Dallas and offered free drinks. But there was no food service because the carts from the original plane wouldn't fit on the replacement. It was wild children. Story 83. There had been serious storms in the days preceding my flight at the city I was flying into. Roofs were damaged, trees were brought down, and there was still some wind around. As we got closer to landing, the turbulence was the worst I had ever experienced. At one stage, after a massive jolt of turbulence that felt like my stomach was in my throat, the oxygen masks dropped. The cabin was completely silent as we all rode this bucking aircraft, and I could hear the engines spooling up and down as the pilots worked to keep things on track. When we touched down and the brakes were applied, a spontaneous burst of applause erupted. I have since heard that this is not uncommon when everyone is just happy to be on the ground again. Story 84. The pilot of the glider I was a passenger in accidentally put us in a long tail slide after a failed attempt at a hammerhead maneuver, essentially free-falling backward in the aircraft. Story 85. The pilot of the glider I was a passenger in accidentally put us in a long tail slide after a failed attempt at a hammerhead maneuver, essentially free-falling backwards in the aircraft. Story 86. The pilot of the glider I was a passenger in accidentally put us into a long tail slide after a failed attempt at a hammerhead maneuver, essentially free-falling backwards in the aircraft. Story 87. I'm not sure about the craziest experience, but probably the scariest was a flight from New York City to Las Vegas. I've noticed that flights to Las Vegas often have bad turbulence, but this one was the worst. It was right after September 11th, and the entire plane was panicking except for the flight attendants. There was loud crying, loud praying, and people throwing up violently. It was absolute chaos. I genuinely thought I was going to die. Story 88. A friend chatted with a seatmate on a cross-country flight. She was a former regional beauty queen. He bought her a drink, and she got tired and laid her head on his lap. They engaged in intimate activity for about 1,500 miles. Story 89. A crash landing from Melbourne to Sydney back in 1986 involved a Boeing plane that United Airlines had taken over from Pan American World Airways, which is now defunct. It was the same plane we took from the United States to Melbourne a few weeks earlier. I was extremely nervous getting back on that same plane because something felt off during the flight there. My intuition was alarmed, and it became a reality. The landing gear wouldn't engage, so the pilot prepared us, and fire trucks and other emergency units were on standby. We had to use the emergency slide to exit. Fortunately, we only suffered bumps and bruises from the hard landing. We ended up being flown home by Qantas Airways, which was a luxurious experience. Felt like the Cadillac of all airlines, but we had to wait 24 hours to arrange that. The media coverage made everything more nerve-wracking. It's funny because I prayed before I left, as I felt something was going to happen, and of course, it did. I looked up that flight a few years later and found out that they retired it and put it in a parts yard. Apologies for the emphasis, but this experience stirred strong emotions. However, I still fly. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.